Representations of intimacy in the Victorian era. 19th century oddities that still shock us today. Greetings. Today we are going to dive into the past, namely the Victorian era of Great Britain. Let's talk about how intimacy was imagined in those times. Is it true that intercourse with a woman was necessarily in the missionary position? What the first female vibrator looked like, and why women had their clitoris removed. Finally, why girls as young as 10 years old became prostitutes. Be sure to watch the video to the very end to learn all the details of that historical period, the English concept of marriage and sex. Let's first understand what the Victorian era is and what people's conceptions were at that time. This period in British history, as you have probably already guessed, is named after Queen Victoria. The Victorian era lasted for almost 65 years, from 1837 to 1901. As you can see, it spanned most of the 19th century. Society in those years had a very different view of bodily intimacy between a man and a woman. For one thing, there was a greater emphasis on the issue of motherhood. People believed that having children was the highest value and the main component in any family. It was extremely important to leave behind a full-fledged heir. And to have sexual intercourse just for fun or for pleasure was not welcomed in England at that time. Such an act was considered immoral. Secondly, sex should be practiced no more than twice a week. A woman should never undress in front of her husband. Otherwise, such an act was also considered immoral. For this purpose, there were specially designated places, screens. Finally, in the century before last, special books devoted to the issue of proper intimacy were actively published. They contained something like a practical guide and advice for both older women and young girls, and such publications were in enormous demand. Thirdly, in the heyday of the Victorian era, in no way supported the initiative of child-free. On the contrary, childbearing, according to the British, became the main occupation in the life of women. True, a woman had to observe a number of rules in the process of intercourse. And what exactly? Let's analyze. Positions and excitement. Oh, how capable of surprising the English with their thoughts and rules of behavior in matters of intimacy. But do not forget that this is a different era, and so the ideas about intimate life were quite different. So, in the process of bodily contact of the bodies were important poses. Now, there are a lot of different variations, but in the 19th century, thought quite differently. It was assumed that the couple should take a missionary position. The woman, in turn, should keep her legs completely straight and in no way bend them. But the standing or kneeling positions between spouses were not welcomed. Among other things, the issue of pleasure was not ignored either. In the Victorian era, it was believed that a woman should not receive it at all. But the man had every right to feel all the delights of intimate activities. Along with this, the English had a peculiar idea of arousal. For example, they believed that the overabundance of excitement will have a negative impact on the state of a girl or woman. And, as the Victorians believed, excessive excitement can lead to fatal injury, or loss of sight and fits of insanity. The vibrator in the Victorian era. And now let's touch on a rather interesting issue related to the self-satisfaction of women of the 19th century. Moreover, it was in this century that the first vibrator appeared. But as you might expect, it looked quite different. It turned out that it was with the help of this method treated a female disease called hysteria. Symptoms of the latter: constant stress, anxiety, and even painful sensations in the abdominal area. That is why vibrators appeared thanks to the efforts of doctors who used them as medical instruments. What was a vibrator in the Victorian era? A hysterical girl or woman would lie down on a bed. Then a doctor, a man, would approach her and spread the crotch of his patient. Finally, he would perform a procedure called genital massage. The main point of such an action was to provoke a female orgasm. At that time, there was no speech about obtaining pleasure at all. This is due to the fact that the doctor required increased concentration of attention to obtain the result. Interesting fact, To replace the so-called manual labor and times simplify the work, Justin came up with an alternative, and it is just vibrators in the classical sense. It is also worth mentioning the clitoris. To the latter, in the second half of the 19th century, formed a not very good attitude. Victorians began to accuse the clitoris that it violates all boundaries of morality in women and leads to promiscuity. Plus, the female half behaved in unnatural ways: hysteria, mental disorders, bad attitude to others. Therefore, one of the doctors suggested an effective, in his opinion, solution: removal of the clitoris. Before this procedure, women were advised herudotherapy, baths with cold water, as well as a special diet. By the way, the result was not long in coming. After removing the clitoris from one of the women, the latter began to behave much better and more feminine. This was just reported by the spouse of the patient. Erotica under Queen Victoria. The question arises, if during the reign of Victoria to become intimate and self-satisfied was considered an immoral act, what about erotica of the 19th century? Was it widespread, and what was it like? Well, let's go through it in order. Erotica in Britain in the century before last was indeed, except that it emerged as a special direction in sexual art and literature. To see such beauty was possible on special erotic postcards. As a rule, the latter were bought by hand. And depicted on such postcards are quite specific images or photographs. They are clearly different from those that exist at the moment. The girl or woman on erotic postcards of the 19th century epitomized the image of a fallen person. Night butterfly or lecherous? She commanded the men who became the objects of her sexual fantasies. Prostitution in the 19th century. It's hard to believe, but the heyday of women's brothels came just in the Victorian era. Surprisingly, it is not possible to count the exact number of prostitutes. Some say about 8,000 priestesses of love, and some believe that they were 10 times more. As they say, prostitutes at that time didn't become from a better life. The path of night butterflies was mainly chosen from poor families. Therefore, prostitutes could become both adult girls, 18 and more years old, and very young girls, from 10 years old. Even orphans became the latter. They were the main value for future clients because the risk of contracting venereal diseases was reduced to a minimum. Older women, in turn, considered prostitution as an additional way to earn money. During the day, they worked at industrial enterprises, not an easy task due to the workload, and after dark, they changed clothes and earned even more. Conclusion. Thus, the Victorian era is characterized by many features of intimate life. The English had to fulfill a number of rules and recommendations to meet the realities of the time. It was in this era that the innovation in the form of the vibrator appeared, and because of the difficult financial situation, young girls had to work in brothels.